Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Sunday, November 2nd, 2025, and today we are going to be talking about the Republican Party and the Voting Rights Act. 2 days before the November 2025 elections, I felt it might be timely to take a look as we are roughly a year out from the 2026 midterms as we see headline after headline of red states across the country preparing for an end to the Voting Rights Act that has been the main reason that Democrats and minority voters in general have representation in many parts of the Deep South and across this nation, as the Voting Rights Act that was passed in the 1960s has served as a standard for the way in which congressional districts are drawn every 10 years to ensure minority districts have the opportunity to have representation at the highest level in Washington, D.C., as the United States Supreme Court appears skeptical. That's right, it seems as if the Supreme Court wants to weaken Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, the exact section that protects Democratic districts across the South that ensure minority representation through states like Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, South Carolina, and so on and so forth. The Republicans are preparing. In the event the U.S. Supreme Court says this is no longer a necessary component of the United States after it is vacated, Republicans could get up to 19 additional House seats after an updated Supreme Court ruling that's set to take place either by emergency declaration in December or all the way out in June of 2026. And this 19-seat estimation comes from an obtained memo that was put together by a Democratic voting group and an organizational group that has minority interests at the forefront of their organizational missions here. What we find is that in their analysis, the Republican Party would target 33 districts in the redistricting that they are set to do over the next year and a half going into the 2026 midterms, and that of those likely districts that they are trying to get rid of are currently VRA protected is ringing in at 19 across the board. And so what they essentially say is that the Republicans, who currently control the majority of these states in the Deep South, in fact, I think every single one, and some of them are not in the Deep South, like Ohio, certainly is not Indiana, certainly is not, but states like Alabama, Florida, Georgia, right? Kentucky. That one's a bit iffy, but still, I would say that certainly is a state that Republicans would target. Missouri, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, all states that Republicans, if they, were to see the abolition or a complete and substantive rewrite of Section 2 of the VRA, that these states could very much pursue congressional redraws that would fundamentally change the dynamics of the 2026 midterms. And I think this goes to show, as Republicans have embarked on this journey across the country, the New York Times put out a really cool article. We'll talk about it a little bit more tomorrow, or maybe later on since it's going to be election eve tomorrow. But the point is, they talk about the future of gerrymandering and how weird things could look across the country as states like California and Texas do, in fact, have opportunities to draw extreme redistricting maps here that would ensure guaranteed Republican representation across Texas, Democratic representation across California. I mean, this would be quite significant across the board here. And what it would do is, and what it does show, is that if there is an appetite from members of the state legislature, the governor, whoever it might be, there are ways to really break this political system. And it really only has been the consequence of the United States Supreme Court and precedent that has existed, like the Voting Rights Act, that has prevented, for instance, Republicans from doing things like this in states like Texas, and in many cases prevented Democrats from being able to do things like this in California. The Voting Rights Act doesn't just protect Democrats, but Republicans would stand to benefit significantly more with its abolition, given that right now, Republicans have already maxed out the number of seats that Democrats could get in the Deep South. If you look at the map from when Obama was first elected president, you'll find that a lot of these seats here that Democrats won weren't being won by Democrats because of the VRA. They were being won because Democrats were popular in states like Tennessee. They were popular in states like Arkansas. Republicans did not even run a candidate in opposition to any of these races in 2008, and 2 years later, Republicans are winning 3 out of the 4, and 2 more years later, Democrats drew this map, by the way, Republicans won every single seat. The reason I bring it up, and you can even find it in 2010, there were more Democrats in the Deep South than there are today, not because of the VRA, but because historically speaking, the Democrats had odd stages of power where they were responsible for congressional redraws, as well as the fact that they had the ability to win in a lot of these districts. Now Republicans have drawn them in such a way that it's damn near impossible to see how Democrats could ever fathom a victory in many of these states. In Tennessee, you'll find that what they did there was very intentional. They drew out the one district the Democrats had in 2020 over here in Tennessee's 5th, a safe Democratic vote sink, but then they decided to draw it out. Gave Republicans 8 seats in Tennessee compared to Democrats at just 1. On the presidential level, Democrats are routinely winning roughly a third of the vote share in Tennessee, and yet have just 1 out of the 9 seats in the state, roughly 11% representation in the state of Tennessee. And so this has happened all across the board here, but it could get even worse. As we see this analysis put forth by the New York Times as well as the voting group, just in the Deep South alone, not even including some of these states, that this contains Indiana, Kentucky, even Texas is not grouped in here. The plausible redistricting scenario is that Republicans just from Louisiana to North Carolina to Florida could gain 12 additional seats across the map here. And there could be a multitude of states like South Carolina, like Tennessee, like Alabama, like Mississippi, and like Louisiana that do not have to draw Democratic districts because their state legislature does not have the appetite or force enough that is compelling them to draw a Democratic district. And all of these seats would be drawn in a way that guarantees universal and 100% Republican representation across very populated states. I mean, this would be the end, I think, of the Democratic Party having a reasonable shot at winning the 2026 midterms, and then instead they would have to do really not the impossible, but would have to do quite well in the 2026 midterms beyond what the expectations already are to even come close to winning the House majority. And I think a great example of exactly how the VRA and as red states are looking to actively prep for this. This reminds me a lot of the Dobbs decision before we even knew that the leak happened in May of 2022. After Amy Coney Barrett got to the United States Supreme Court, Democratic groups and Republican groups sort of braced for what many people thought was the inevitable, and those people were correct. The end of Roe v. Wade as we knew it, a law of the land that had existed, for nearly as long as Section 2 of the VRA from 1973 to 2022, it was precedent that abortion was legal across the country, and this Republican-controlled Supreme Court decided that was no longer the case. But the Republicans in red states got a heads up. Even in purple states, passed forth trigger laws that allowed the moment that the Dobbs decision came down, or whatever case it was going to be, the moment abortion rights were returned to the will of the states, the moment that happened, complete and total bans across the country were implemented. Complete and total bans across this nation were implemented in many states from Wisconsin, age-old laws from the 1800s in Arizona. I mean, you are talking about preparation for this. Some cases that wasn't even prep for this, but just was never repealed because there was never even a consideration that it might be necessary. But simultaneously, you are finding that the VRA is something that the Republican Party right now is actively prepping for its overturning. And I think I meant to mention this earlier than the point I'm about to just make. But looking at the 2018 midterm elections, I want you to take a look at this election in particular. What do we remember? Well, we covered it on this channel, and it was, by every metric, a Democratic wave. Democrats won 40 seats across the country, demolished Republicans on a comparative level, especially looking at the 2016 versus, 2018 shift. The map here is pretty substantially blue. A fourth of the districts swung over 15 points to the left. And so thinking about why I'm bringing up 2018, not only was it the last time Democrats had a wave year, but if the VRA was to go, you would have to deduct 19 seats from the Democratic Party on this map. 19 seats from the Democratic Party. Well, what does that give you on this level? What does that do? Essentially, Democrats would go from a substantial majority of 235 to 200 down to 216 to the Republican majority of 218. An election where Democrats won on the national popular vote by 8.6% would result in a House map of a Republican majority. Why? Because that's what the Voting Rights Act, not as a means of, saving the Democratic Party, but being a natural component of these districts and these dynamics at play here, contribute to the majority the Democrats historically have been able to rely on if they're having a wave year. In the same way that Republicans have been able to rely on their excessive gerrymanders year in and year out in many of these races, right? And so thinking about, what we saw is actually quite interesting. I'm just looking at the Kansas 2nd District there. I thought that one was quite fascinating. In either case, though, what we're looking at is that the VRA, as it stands today, doesn't serve as this protector of the Democratic Party. It is merely a protector of democracy. It stands to be the reason that Republicans can't just steal election after election, because that is what they are trying to do. Could you fathom the 2018 midterms being a blue wave if Democrats had lost the House? Democrats seriously could have won by 9 points nationally and still lost the House majority by 2 without the VRA, which I think underscores the importance too. And what you will find is that representation for all minority groups across the country, black voters, Hispanic voters, Asian voters, whatever, you would find the VRA doesn't just protect one subsection of the American electorate. It protects every group of voters, and in some cases actually is the reason California can't have such an egregious Democratic gerrymander. A reason why Illinois couldn't pass a 17-0 VRA compliant map. And again, Republicans would still stand to benefit more from its destruction, which is why they are still moving forward with it, even though in some cases and in some of these states, if they truly cared, they would care about having Republicans from Illinois, Republicans from California, Republicans from New York, because without the VRA, in 4 years' time, 5 years' time, when the redraw happens, Democrats are going to go for quite extreme maps here if the VRA is in fact overturned. Because the moment that it is, Republicans are going to use that to their advantage and really hone in on Democratic districts across the country, which I really think shows just how desperate they are for the 26 midterms. Because they know they can't win it fairly. They know that they can't combat what you are seeing on the national level of a massive push away from Donald Trump as president of the United States. When I think about the 24 elections, the reason Republicans were able to maintain House control wasn't because they were exceptionally popular. They were carried across the finish line by a president who had a candidate for president who did remarkably well for himself, no doubt about that. But without him at the top of the ticket, you probably aren't seeing that happen across the board. The most recent data point we actually just saw, which is quite interesting, we talked about it earlier today, was NBC News' new generic ballot poll. And what does it tell us? Well, it's quite clear. Across the board here, it is the Republicans who are losing support, not the Democrats. Even though Republicans have a higher approval rating than the Democrats, Donald Trump has a higher approval rating than the Democrats, it doesn't change the fact that more voters want to elect Democrats compared to Republicans on the national level. And that is a huge change here that I think really shows that the support for the Democratic Party is climbing, even if voters aren't saying that they love the party. They may be discontent with Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer, but it doesn't mean they won't vote for the party. And Republicans, like everybody else, and like all of you watching this video, can absolutely read the writing on the wall that 2026 is not shaping up to be a good year for the GOP, is not shaping up to be an environment where Donald Trump can recover his approval rating and rebound to a point that puts his political party in the driver's seat, because that is not what we are seeing. And I think about the 2018 midterms and why the VRA back then could have really, if it was to go, would have done in the Democratic Party in a year that was undoubtedly one of their best performance they have seen since Obama 10 years prior in 2008. And without the VRA, Republicans would have maintained control of the House, not just for 2018, but through 2020, 2022, 2024. It would have been constant rule of law for the GOP from 2010 to today, and for many more years to come. Because without Section 2, the Democratic odds at winning the House in 2026 jump down to about 50%. Maybe 50%. That's being generous. And I think that's where you see why Republicans are so anxiously awaiting their Supreme Court to side with them to give them the upper hand for the 2026 midterms, because they can't win voters alone. They can't win over the elections the same way that they used to be able to. And they know the only way it's possible is with direct intervention from the United States Supreme Court in a way that fundamentally changes our map. And not just with the Texas or Missouri or Indiana redraw. You are talking about throwing out the entire playbook and law of the land from 1964 because their president is unpopular and they can't win without changing the rules and rigging the election. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch, and then a playlist for my 2026 House election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all